The ABCs of God's constant love. Top of the morning to you. So this is like a half poem, mostly truth piece inspired by the Psalms entitled The ABCs of God's Constant Love. Enjoy. The ABCs of God's constant love, inspired by the Psalms. When I think of God's love and what He does for me, it's completely overwhelming from A to Z. So here are my takeaways about this musing. Hopefully it inspires and is not confusing. All the things God's love does is available for free. So let's deep dive in, take a look, and let's see. A. God's love constantly amazes, adores, awakens. B. God's love constantly blesses, beautifies, and brightens. C. God's love constantly completes, conquers, and crowns us. D. God's love constantly drives, delivers, and delights us. E. God's love constantly encourages, enlightens, enriches us. F. God's love constantly floods, flourishes, and fathers us. G. God's love constantly guides and guards us. H. God's love constantly helps, holds, and humbles us. I. God's love constantly ignites us as well. J and K. God's love constantly justifies and keeps us. L. God's love constantly liberates us too. M. God's love constantly marvels, meets, and molds us. N. God's love constantly nourishes and nurtures us. O. God's love constantly overwhelms and overflows us. P. God's love constantly pursues, prospers, and preserves us. Q and R. God's love constantly quakes us, rewards us, and revives us. S. God's love constantly saves, satisfies, and strengthens us. T. God's love constantly teaches, tenderizes, and trains us. U through Z. God's love constantly unveils, veers, and washes. His love constantly X-factors us. Yeah, that's a stretch. And finally, God's love constantly yields us and outright zaps us with the energy, motivation, and desire to constantly get us stronger, enabling us to obey His teaching just a little longer. For it takes all our hearts, mind, and strength to complete in us what is lacking, to love God with all our might and our neighbors without slacking.